there's a letter written a little over 2,000 years ago, tucked away at the end of this collection of books we call the Bible. It was written by a man called John, and John's letter was written to be read out loud to groups of the followers of Jesus of Nazareth who were trying to live out the movement they believed that Jesus was all about in the face of the Roman Empire and the empire culture at the start of the first century. We call the letter the Revelation because it's a set of visions, a set of perspectives, a set of angles, a set of views. It's like a glimpse, or a series of glimpses actually, behind the scenes, behind the curtain, through, particularly at this point, an open door, where John can see into a reality that's going on now, but isn't always obvious to everyone else. And John seems to get a glimpse into what the living God is doing now. And that's not an unreasonable question. What is God doing now? Part of John's vision is the image of a scroll or a book. And it seems that that book in this image seems to represent a plan or a project that this God has to put everything to rights. And right in the middle of what John sees is a throne, and next to that throne is a lamb that looks like it's been slain, and it's pretty obvious that this is referring to Jesus of Nazareth, who lived and died and was resurrected. And somehow in that, his life and his death and resurrection has dealt with everything that gets in the way of this project, and now God's plan can move forward to put everything back together. And so the Lamb starts to open the 7 seals on this scroll. And as the first 4 have been opened, we've seen that the first thing that's exposed, that's revealed, is actually the situation that the creation is in. And we've seen the effects of the human condition that is recycled throughout history after empire tries to go its own way, and leading just to war, to infighting, to inequality, to famine and pollution that affects everyone, but also everything. So now, in chapter 6, when this 5th seal is opened, the image then is of souls under an altar. Souls who'd been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they maintained. It would be so great if this collection of writings was a story of well-behaved religious people who sat around being happy and safe, shielded and smug in their religious holy bubble because they did what God told them to do. But it's not. Instead, it's a painfully real set of stories of broken humans and broken creation regularly crying out to God. It seems that being a follower of God doesn't protect you from war, from civil unrest, from inequality, from pollution, from famine, from suffering and death. And these souls under the altar seem to represent the followers of God who've tried to live out who they were made to be, who've joined in with God, what he's doing, who've tried to be a blessing, to be a light to the world, to mend, to fix, to heal, to stand for justice, and they've suffered and died because the empire, the opposition to God's way, to God's creation project, wants to get rid of that. And so these followers have stood in the crossfire, and they've suffered and died like everyone else around them who's become a victim. The image of the altar is one of worship. It reflects the idea of the temple, the Jewish temple, the great symbol for where God would connect with them, where they could respond, where they could give thanks, where they could take their prayers to God. It's a place of safety, of sanctuary. It's a place of God's presence, and in God's presence they are crying out. I've heard a lot of crying out over the last week or two. Phone calls, texts, emails. Let's face it, we are weary. How long will this situation last? When will it end? I've had enough of it, people have told me. The story of these souls under the altar, this story of crying out, this whole story of the Jewish people, of God and his creation, is actually a story of a God who hears the cry and acts. The roots of Jesus' story, the Jewish story, is in a book called Exodus. And it begins with them crying out in slavery, and it leads to God setting them free, but not just to be free, but sets them free to be the people they were made to be part of putting things back together. He is the God who hears the cry, the God of the oppressed. These souls are crying out, asking when God will judge some people they call the inhabitants of earth. Now, John is a poet, he's an artist, he's inspired by this experience he has of the living Jesus and about seeing this glimpse behind the scenes. And he uses phrases that seem to be shorthand time and time again. One is inhabitants of earth, or in some translations, earth dwellers. It seems to be a shorthand phrase not for everybody who lives in the world, but for those parts of creation that are rebelling against what God is doing. So these people are crying out, when will God put this to rights? When will God deal with his enemies? Everything that works against what he's doing. When we hear in here the word judge, that word carries the idea of saving as well as sorting things out. This is about bringing justice, about proportions, about putting things to rights. This is not a cry for revenge or punishment, a cry for justice. And for those who are tied up in creating the injustice, that will mean God will deal heavily, powerfully, mightily with that, and that will be bad news for God's opposition, for anything that is trying to destroy God's creation project. These souls are told to hold on, to rest, to wait a little longer. Bizarrely then it says, until the full number have been slain. It would be easy at this point to assume that this means that this God sat down ages ago and picked a number that he wanted killed, and now he's waiting on his calculator to see how long it takes for that number to reach before that number's killed, and then he might do something about it. That doesn't sound like the kind of God I'd be interested in. It also doesn't sound like the kind of God that's revealed in the whole 65 books of this Bible that come before this letter. This vision that John has and his letter is not given to make people feel bad. It's given to comfort and to challenge them. What John's listeners would be drinking up like water in the desert right now is not the idea that there's a set number of people who have to be killed. It would instead be the image here that there is a limit, that there will be an end, that this is actually good news, news of hope. It seems that God seems to be allowing the consequences to play out because he doesn't want to give up, because he wants his creation to turn around, and he wants his creatures, humanity and all in it, to turn around and be who they were made to be. But there will be a limit. So when it talks about the full number, it means the full consequences of what humanity has chosen. This is not something God has chosen. This is something his creation has chosen, and it breaks his heart to see it play out, and it will not last forever. The next part of the vision is a great crisis of earthquakes and noise and sound and light and darkness covering the whole of the creation. I've told you before that out of the 400 verses in this letter of Revelation, there's over 500 references to the other 65 books in the Bible. John's listeners would recognize in this vision symbols from books of hope and warning like Joel, stories of God meeting with his people on Mount Sinai in Exodus, other warnings and encouragements in books like Hosea and Isaiah. The images of a God who can shake the whole creation, or the whole creation shaking itself apart because of its rebellion to God. If the signs and symbols so far have been revealing the state of the creation project at this point and how it's being affected, it would make sense to see this more like God saying, okay, you've said you're in charge. It's your empire. Let's see how your plan works out, how you hold things together. And instead of tending and caring and bringing the creation to its potential, what's happening is that things are coming apart at the seams. You don't need me or John to tell you that. John's describing the diagnosis that scientists and economists and philosophers and sociologists and journalists and movements like International Justice Mission would agree with. Humanity in its empire mode, in its full consumption, in its me mode, is tearing the creation apart. And in this vision, that leads to hiding. There's been plenty of hiding throughout the story of Scripture, starting right in the first poems in Genesis, when the first humans chose to be selfish instead of taking up the challenge God had for them, and then they hid. A good question to ask here is, who's hiding? Earlier, John talked about the inhabitants of earth, the earth dwellers, as a shorthand for all those who are working actively against what God is doing. And that's who seems to be hiding. And rightly so. There's no exceptions in what's happening for the highest of the elite. They're not protected in their bubble. The kings, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and right down to the slave and the free. Every level is affected. But notice, the highest proportions of that list are not the slaves. Where does the biggest responsibility lie? Perhaps with those who would claim they are the empire, the ones who offer peace and happiness, and all their promises are shown up as useless as things fall apart. And they hide from the wrath of the Lamb. There's a surprising phrase. I don't know if you've met many lambs. I have. They're pretty pushy. They want milk, they want food, and they'll suck and chew your fingers off and try and get milk out of you. Their tongues are actually quite rough. They might give you a nudge in the knee a couple of times while you're petting them. But wrath? Lambs are not about wrath. And surely Jesus of Nazareth isn't about wrath. He's about love and turning the other cheek and wearing sandals and probably eating a bit less meat, isn't he? The God in these stories does not, despite what the idea you might have been given from other places, come across as angry by default. Have a read through yourself. You might be surprised, but that doesn't mean that this God doesn't get angry and isn't moved. What we find is that this God is slow to anger. And this God tends not to get angry with individuals, but he does get worked up about things like injustice and suffering and oppression and slavery and abuse and anything that works destructively against his project of love and justice and peace and growth and bringing things to their potential. God's wrath. Jesus' wrath in this image, if you want a really clumsy metaphor, seems to be a bit like the treatments we might use on conditions like cancer. Cancer is obviously destructive. To get rid of it involves treatments like radiation and chemotherapy that are painful and destructive to the sufferer. It's because the cancer is so tied up in the bones or the blood or the glands or the organs of the person that the treatment to get rid of it is so destructive. Getting rid of the bad stuff, it also destroys the good tissues around it. That's a very crude way of thinking about how God's wrath is talked about in these stories. The wrath of the Lamb, the judgment of God, is about putting things to rights, about bringing things back to how they were meant to be, about getting rid of the destructive parts, about bringing justice and life where there's been injustice and destruction. And for anyone or anything that is tied up in that empire way of life, that is bad news, something to hide from. When everything is falling apart, the question that rings out at this point is who can stand? Who can stand? Maybe we'll find out next week.